So Gary, you have the opportunity to rebut anything that Melissa brought up.
So I would put forth for everyone's consideration whether all the acceptance that we put on methylmercury and neurodevelopmental effects in terms of our willingness to do risk-benefit, cost-benefit on that endpoint, and we are now intervening in the marketplace in a big way, telling pregnant women, women of childbearing age, not to eat certain fish, is based upon a huge epidemiology study that was negative, which was the Seychelles Islands study. The Faroe Islands study, which was positive, diametrically 180 degrees, with no explanation why they diverged. And then you had this small New Zealand study, which also showed an effect. And the National Academy in 2000 had a major report on methylmercury and said, yes, this endpoint's real, based upon basically that evidence and some, but you know, it was basically driven by the human evidence. And so it was also, and so I think what we're seeing is that the effects when you're adding to a background level of problem in the population and all the confounders, all the risk factors that are going to vary, it's very context specific. Which fish are people eating? What else are people teaching their children? What schools are they going to in terms of IQ? Or what exercise, what sedentary, you know, in terms of the risk factor for cardiovascular that's not controlled for in these studies that are going to lead to this kind of epidemiological mishmash of evidence. And so I would put forth for the consideration that if we're accepting neurodevelopment, why shouldn't we be, you know, at least walking down this path of cardiovascular? And the other point I would make is that whichever side you want to take on this, is that I think this points out the size of the importance of this issue. That if 80% of the risk and the benefit from mercury emissions could theoretically be something as important as cardiovascular death, this is not, you know, just 1 or 2 IQ points. We're talking about life and death here. I think that this, you know, underscores the importance of this particular endpoint for mercury.
I'm going to continue to stay in role here. Understood, and the analogy between methylmercury and neurotoxic effects and heart impacts, cardiovascular impacts, well taken. That's an important concept. At the same time, the evidence for neurologic effects, both biologically and experimentally, were so far better established prior to the epi studies being put forward. So we had decades of evidence to show that methylmercury was a neurotoxicant, whereas the notion that methylmercury is damaging cardiovascular health, it really has only been discussed, let's say, in the last 10 to 15 years. So it's not nearly as compelling. Another very important point to point out, as we've been talking about our stalwart protection of objectivity as scientists and the attempt to replicate with the most objective means possible, the EPA panel that gathered here and wrote up, a very esteemed panel, wrote up their conclusions, said, we use professional judgment in our qualitative evaluations of the strength of evidence associated with each effect. If that's what we're reducing to, then I don't know if we've accomplished that much when it comes to careful, judicious use of application of the causality principles that we've been talking about the last day and a half. So without a convergence across these different criteria, the Bradford Hill criteria, we're not there yet. And in fact, much of it has to do with a dearth and a shortfall in what our methods are and the ability for toxicology and epidemiology to converge. And I think that some of the ideas that we saw yesterday as it related to even greedy searches and machine learning algorithms could help us get there. But right now, we are using rudimentary techniques and methods in order to get an answer to a complex question.
And it is a valid point that the mercury neurodevelopmental studies in monkeys by Deb Rice et al. Were really seminal in terms of showing experimentally that you can produce some of these things at low dose. And we don't have an animal study that shows you can create a heart attack in a monkey, rat, or mouse from mercury exposure of any kind. So yeah, that is a difference in the two. But I think that the stakes are pretty high. And I'll just bring up something else from my past. When I was at some ALAR hearings, which was an apple pesticide a long time ago, and the EPA people were looking at it, and they said, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a carcinogen, you know? And, you know, if you've got the evidence that it is knocking down a key lipid antioxidant in the blood, and if you've got the evidence that it is thickening the intima media in 3 out of 3 studies that it's been looked at for that endpoint, and if you've got some of the oxidative stress, I would say that in my mind, it probably is a key cardiovascular risk factor. However, I would agree that it would be a big argument to try to make that stand up from a regulatory context.
Let's go ahead and go to the audience. Please identify yourself.
Ken Bucklehead, Brown University. My question is, when you looked at the literature that's available to you on the epi side and on the tox side, do you take into account publication bias that it's more likely that a positive result will be published than a negative? And do you treat epi studies and tox studies differentially in the assumption of that publication bias being present?
In this particular field, well, I have to admit that I didn't look for that or didn't try to think that through. I'm not sure how one evaluates publication bias for things that you don't see because they were never published. And so you tend to see perhaps more of the positive. But in this particular case, with the emphasis on the benefits of fish ingestion on cardiovascular endpoints and the promotion of fish for that purpose, that this actually has been a major point that people, especially Mozaffarian et al. Out of Harvard, has made a big point of publishing several studies on this, and so have some of the people to show the negative, the null on mercury and cardiovascular. So I'm not that worried about that in this case.
I think it's an excellent point. I thought about it in the context of this notion of failure. So if, in fact, what we're doing is constantly falsifying what it is that we observe, then we're not doing a very good job of equally respecting failure as we publish it. And at the same time, the other thing, and this isn't publication bias, but being struck by the dearth of adequate epidemiologic studies and how much time and labor intensiveness goes into being able to conduct such a study. So that struck me as well. So it's unlikely that a prospective study was funded, well conducted, followed forward, had enough sample size to evaluate this association, and didn't get published even if it was negative. But there are so few because it takes so much.
So let's go to these 2 questions here, and then we'll go to the next topic. Let's go ahead.
Hi, Kevin Elliott from Michigan State, member of the committee. So I wanted to follow up on Gary's point when he just said that the stakes are pretty high. And so this is partly a question you two could address, but it could also feed into our further discussions. And I was just wondering, in terms of the way we're framing the discussion, we've seen it's so tricky to decide, do we say there's actually evidence that there is a cause or not? And I just wondered if you think it would be helpful to reframe the question as, how can we better express the amount of evidence, say, rather than a yes or no, given that the regulators have to be making decisions? Is it more important for us to be thinking about how do we sort of give a reasonable account of the level of evidence so the regulators can decide if they want to take action, rather than just a yes-no conclusion? So anyway, you may or may not want to address that now, but just something for us to be thinking about how we address this.
Because Gary's a regulator.
Yeah, my perspective on that is not so much as trying to grade the level of evidence, but to look at it from the context of the amount, the red flags that we have on this endpoint and the importance of this overall makes us really pay attention to this issue. And that the difficulty that we know that epidemiology has when you've got confounders, very clear confounders in this case, because the major source of mercury exposure is also the major source of preventive antioxidant lipids in fish. So it's more a matter of the importance in trying to be protective and preventive on something that may be a big risk factor. And when you've got a disease like cardiovascular disease that we know is oxidant-driven, inflammation-driven, and that you've got something that's pro-oxidant, pro-inflammation in the diet, I think it's really important to take a very close look at that.
Joel?
Thank you. So I want to make 2 points. One, on the point that Melissa brought up about analogy, and I think that is something where we can do better. So for example, in the VIVA study, which was looking at cognitive effects in children, it's a birth cohort in Eastern Massachusetts, they did find evidence of negative confounding. So they didn't have to do the offline calculation. They actually showed that they both underestimated the risk associated with prenatal methylmercury exposure and underestimated the protective effect of the omega-3 exposure by not putting them both in the model. So that's something I think we could pay a little more attention to. It's not the same outcome, but it at least tells us something. And give me a moment and see if I can remember what the second point was. Too much mercury. Right. The other point had to do with exposure, right? When we use maternal hair mercury as an index of prenatal exposure, that's a pretty good index, right? It has temporality, not in the sense of, preceding the effect, but, right, you get a couple of months of exposure and that's like in the period of pregnancy, right? When you use toenail mercury as an index of your exposure for cardiovascular disease, that's a much, much noisier index of exposure. And we know that noisy exposure measures tend to bias effect sizes towards the null. Okay? I mean, a toenail is capturing a couple of months of exposure. And now you have to think, well, what do I think is the mechanism that links mercury exposure to cardiovascular disease if it's true? Is it ongoing chronic inflammation and oxidative stress? In that case, I would like a measure that's well correlated, that is an integrated measure over my 10 years of follow-up of mercury exposure. And if what I have is a measure of 2 months of exposure at the beginning of follow-up, then how good is that? And to answer that question, we would need to have studies where there are repeated measures of toenail mercury over time that show that it's kind of stable, right? And we don't have that. And in fact, I doubt it's true. So I think when we're thinking about these things and evaluating the evidence, we also need to think about what are the exposure metrics that were used and how good are they and what might that do to the findings of the
So
study.
I think these points raised by Joel are great for the panel discussion. So let's just hold those comments about exposure for that part, and let's move ahead to our next topic. Let's first thank our participants for debate one.